Hello and welcome to Chewing It Over. And I think this is my third takeover, Rheumatology takeover of the Chewing It Over stream. You'll notice that I am not, of course, Jack Chew. I am a more southern version of him with slightly better hair. And my name is Jack March from Rheumatology.Physio. So first up, if somebody very kind who is watching puts a thumbs up into the chat bar to make sure that you can hear and see me okay, and I'm not just talking at a blank computer screen, that would be absolutely ideal. And we are going to chat over some of the questions that I was unfortunately forced to leave unanswered at TherapyLive due to a lack of time. I've got a lovely thumbs up from Sally Roberts here. Thank you, Sally, for being able to see and hear me, and also for tuning in. And hello to Ellie as well. And hopefully we will cover some good ground. I've got a few questions, like I say, set up from the TherapyLive Q&A tab, and we will go through some of those. But if you have any questions about axial spondyloarthritis in women, then please do put them into the chat bar, and I'll endeavour to answer as many as I can get through in the next sort of 27 minutes or so. Alistair Beverley's describing me as horrifying, which I find rather mean after I've helped him out quite a lot with podcasting. So you can be nice to me in the chat bar, Alistair. So I'm just going to grab my questions up here from TherapyLive, and the first one that I want to cover is regarding whether inflammatory pain or inflammatory symptoms related to axial spondyloarthritis, and I suppose we could open this up to the other types of inflammatory arthritis as well, could this inflammatory pain vary with a woman's cycle? So I'm going to make the assumption that that's related to the menstrual cycle. And the answer to the question, I suppose, is yes, certainly. And I think that there's a variety of reasons for this. One, we know that a female nervous system would become more or less sensitive at different times of the cycle. So it might be that the responses to that inflammation is raised or suppressed at certain times of that cycle, but also if there is any stress associated with the changes in estrogen, progesterone as they swap over, then that could also impact on the inflammatory system, the immune system as well, and therefore make those symptoms, the inflammation itself, more significant as well. So I think a combination of those things will mean that it can vary with cycles. And I have spoken to a number of patients who they know at certain points of their cycle that they are going to have, for want of a better term, a flare-up. They're going to feel worse. They're going to have more significant stiffness of the joints, more swelling, more redness, more pain, etc. And they can sort of set their watch by it almost. But it hasn't been something that I've noticed is particularly consistent with the portion of the cycle in individuals that occurs in. So some people would happen at the end of the menstrual cycle, some at the beginning, some somewhere around the middle. And I think we know that all individuals differ, and that would be the same with menstrual cycles as well. So it's something to be aware of, but it's something that I don't think we can use. It's certainly not something we can use diagnostically, but I have known some women go on to some types of medication to try and manage their cycle to make it more consistent, so that it's that has helped with their symptoms in the past. So hopefully that answers a little bit to that. Probably one of those questions that's rather complex that I don't know if we understand everything around it as yet. The next question that we've got is sort of along a similar set of lines, which is, does flare-up of symptoms increase inflammatory activity, or is the inflammatory process stable and actually other triggers that have increased the perception of the pain? So again, this is sort of alluding to, is that are those inflammatory reactions against in axial spondyloarthritis against the enthesis, are they remaining level? And actually it's our nervous system that's being elevated or sensitized. So again, for want of a better term, we're feeling those reactions more keenly or interpreting them more keenly. Or is it actually that the inflammatory process is being raised? And I think, again, sit on the fence here, it's going to be a combination of those two situations. So depending on what you're looking at, then those two things are going to be increased or stay level to a certain degree, and of course sometimes both will be increased. So let's take something like an infection. So I don't know if everybody's noticed, but the COVID-19 is causing us some problems at the moment. So let's say you've got axial spondyloarthritis and you come into contact with COVID-19. This is your inflammatory process. So your immune system is going to be elevated to combat that COVID-19 infection. So that's going to elevate. That's probably also going to elevate the nervous system as well. So you might bring both of those up. Now let's take something like stress, financial stress, for example. That directly is not really going to increase your inflammatory process. It might do in some, and other factors, so like if you were sleeping less or eating poorly or something else was occurring because of that stress, then that might elevate this up. But it's certainly going to bring the nervous system up. So you're going to feel that same level of inflammatory response more keenly. So again, it's one of those things where if we're getting people who are flaring regularly, then it is something that's worth investigating more keenly. So blood tests to see when they're in a flare-up, whether their inflammatory chemicals, inflammatory markers are elevating significantly. So if there is their ESR, their CRP elevating significantly, then it might well be that actually what the rheumatologists need to do is change their medication regime, or have some sort of short-term changes when those happen. So again, I've seen people on take anti-inflammatories during that situation, or other types of intervention might be helpful. Or of course, addressing the underlying cause is always helpful. So again, I think it's difficult in the individual to be specific at the time, but certainly a combination of those two things, the increase in inflammatory activity, but also the increase in the sensitivity of the nervous system. So moving backwards to a bit more about sort of female presentations of axial spondyloarthritis and how they obviously differ between men. And this question here we've got is about many women have irritable bowel syndrome, and even if not diagnosed with Crohn's or colitis, is IBS a reason to increase clinical suspicion in women with axial spondyloarthritis? And this is a really good question. So within the talk that I did at TherapyLive, we discussed that the incidence of Crohn's and colitis, so inflammatory bowel disease, is elevated in women. I don't know why I've got a real desire to use my hands as seesaws today. So the incidence of Crohn's and colitis in spondyloarthritis in women is elevated compared to men. So you'll often see women have colitis and then develop spondyloarthritis afterwards. We obviously also know that irritable bowel syndrome is very common in women. And what I tend to say on my courses is that irritable bowel syndrome in itself is not a risk factor for developing spondyloarthritis. It's one of those medically unexplained conditions, if you will. I remember a podcast on Physio Matters with Roger Kerry a few years ago talking about this, and irritable bowel syndrome is one of those. However, if the lady is sitting in front of you and they've never had irritable bowel syndrome investigated appropriately, so either through gastroenterology or something more sensible, then it's something that we, certainly I as a physiotherapist, would be very uncomfortable diagnosing irritable bowel syndrome over another type of gut issue or bowel issue. So it would be something that if they'd been diagnosed with IBS via the GP, that might raise my clinical suspicion some, but wouldn't raise it as much as a formal diagnosis of Crohn's or colitis. So we're going to go, there's going to be a tipping point somewhere where the lady has enough inflammatory symptoms that you say, actually, probably the IBS is irrelevant at the moment because there's enough inflammatory symptoms that I'm going to refer to rheumatology anyway. And then we've got the other flip side where you go, oh, actually, this lady has some inflammatory symptoms, but they aren't really, really obvious. So it's then you go, okay, well, if that IBS was colitis, I would be referring. So you might then be sort of either having a clinical discussion with one of your colleagues to work out which way you're going to go, or it might be referring to the GP to refer to gastroenterology, or it might be actually you go, I'm going to err on the side of caution here, refer into rheumatology and let them pull the whole thing apart. So it's something where it's pretty difficult to give a specific answer, but something that we should certainly be keeping within our clinical reasoning model. I noticed I've got a question here, a couple of questions in the chat bar from David Poulter, who is always great to get a question. Thank you for tuning in, David. And this is a really difficult question to answer, where am I suggesting there's a correlation between the amount of inflammation and the amount of pain intensity? And if you take that from the point of view of saying, as a population question, then the answer will probably be yes, you probably can correlate the amount of inflammation and the amount of pain intensity. So in axial spondyloarthritis, for example, then you would see people with a high level of inflammation are getting axial spondyloarthritis symptoms. So I would correlate there's that amount of inflammation and the pain intensity. However, if you then go into an individual, does someone with a CRP or a CRP of 50 and an ESR of 62, do they have more pain than someone with a CRP of 10 and an ESR of 22? The answer to that question is no, not necessarily. So it's a really difficult answer, but you do have to make some correlations between, like I said, the inflammatory level and the raise of the nervous system. And can you differentiate those two things out in the individual? I'm not certain. So a lot of things that would increase inflammation would also increase the sensitivity of the nervous system, and some things that would increase the sensitivity of the nervous system would also increase the amount of inflammation. So I think it's really complex, as we understand that pain is extremely complex, and we certainly need to take things into context, which I think is why if someone has one flare-up, I wouldn't be investigating. But if someone's having multiple flare-ups, then I would be interested in whether their inflammatory system is increasing. And I think you can use other symptoms alongside pain. So pain wouldn't be the only measure that I'm using. I would use other inflammatory type symptoms, so stiffness of the joints, fatigue, pain, I said it again, swelling, redness of the joints, other symptoms as well alongside pain, because obviously patients who have these inflammatory conditions do have a lot of persistent pain syndromes as well. So there's a big crossover. So hopefully that's answered some way to answer some of your question, David, but in all honesty, I would not admit to being extremely high up on my pain science and understanding of pain processing. So I will admit to, if I've made any errors within that, then I'm happy to be picked up on that. Whilst we're talking about flare-ups, I also had a question on TherapyLive about remission and relapse, so symptoms that wax and wane, and specifically it was about how long can the interval between each relapse be, and again the answer is pretty much how long is a piece of string. We get lots of people who have quite regular flare-ups and lots of people who will go have no symptoms whatsoever for a few years and then it will come back later. And one of the issues I've seen in the delayed diagnosis with axial spondyloarthritis patients is that they might have symptoms for 2 or 3 months. They go and see a physiotherapist, for example. The physiotherapist treats them, their symptoms get better, and they stay better for quite an extended period of time. So of course everybody goes, or the therapist and the patient go, when I had physiotherapy last time, it sorted it out, and away we go. Whereas actually what happened was the natural course of the inflammatory process just dipped off, or as we were just talking about, the thing that raised the inflammatory system or the nervous system enough to be suffering from those symptoms, that eased off, and so those symptoms weren't problematic anymore, and around we go in this sort of circle. So it is important to still be looking out for those inflammatory type symptoms, even in someone with sort of relatively short periods of time of symptoms. Okay, so next we've got a couple of questions about MRIs, and about the how much we should put onto the reports of the MRIs, or how much weight we should put on negative MRIs. So if a patient has inflammatory type symptoms and they go and have an MRI and they come back with no changes on imaging, so no inflammatory changes in the sacroiliac joints or none in the spine, then that doesn't mean that rules out an inflammatory spinal arthritis. So it doesn't rule out an axial spondyloarthritis entirely. This, as a lot of conditions are now, this is a clinical diagnosis rather than a radiological one, and everything has to be put into context. So obviously, if you have someone who has some early morning spinal stiffness, their pain is worse with rest, better with activity, they wake in the second half of the night, it's better with anti-inflammatories, and then you MRI their spine and you see sacroiliitis bilaterally, you see some inflammatory changes within their spine as well, then that just adds a lot more weight onto the likelihood of that being an inflammatory diagnosis. If you take that same clinical presentation and they have a negative MRI, so no sacroiliitis, no inflammatory changes in the spine, then this is why we have rheumatologists, and they're very clever. They will take those clinical symptoms, they will take the blood tests, and they will take the negative MRI, and they will make a decision as to whether they think that, or they will conclude that those symptoms are most likely caused by an axial spondyloarthritis. So it's all about what information adds onto the clinical weight of your seesaw. So more information on one side makes it more likely, less information or more information on the other side makes it less likely. And it's about weighing those situations up to make that clinical decision. So it is very difficult. The second sort of portion to that question is, do the scans, can they come back positive later on? And yes, that is the case, but also so is the case that they can come back negative if they've already had a positive one. So there are some studies looking at serial MRIs where they do an MRI every month for 3 months, and they do show a great variation in what is shown on the MRIs in individuals. So some individuals will show MRI changes on all 3, some will show it on 1 out of 3, 2 out of 3, of a whole host of variation. So it does differ quite significantly, which means that you do have to be careful with negative MRIs and ruling the condition out. And again, I would be going on inflammatory symptoms. So if you've got someone who comes into your clinic, so I'm sort of thinking first contact practitioners or musculoskeletal assessment clinics. If you've got a patient who comes into clinic who has inflammatory symptoms but they've had a negative MRI, then you may well still refer that patient into rheumatology. You also need to understand what type of MRI they've had, because a standard MRI, lumbar MRI with sacroiliac joints, won't have the appropriate sequencing on to make decisions about inflammatory changes. So you need specific sequencing for that. So understanding what they've had, when they had it, then it's a very complex set of decision making. And certainly I would feel very uncomfortable not referring to rheumatology off the back of a negative MRI unless you were really lacking some confidence with that decision anyway. I always come back to this sort of this situation where I think, what is the situation where the patient's symptoms are so on the fence that negative MRI means I'm not referring to rheumatology? It's one of those things where if they've got inflammatory, certainly if I was doing the MRI, if they've got inflammatory symptoms enough that I decide I need to do an MRI, then that patient's going to rheumatology. So it becomes a very interesting conundrum at that point, and we do talk a lot about that on my courses and try and do our decision making. But in the end, it is a judgment call to a degree. There is no hard and fast rules, although there are some tools out there which can be helpful. The SPADE tool, for example. So if you click SPADE tool, SPADETOOL.co.uk into Google, then that's a decision-making aid. It's got some tick boxes that you can tick what patient's symptoms are, and it will give you an idea of what you should do with that patient, whether you should refer them into rheumatology or conduct further investigations. Emma is waving at me. Hi, Emma. Is that what you were asking for? I'm not sure. If you've got a question, please feel free to ask it. So the other question that we've got here is about safety netting, and this is something I think obviously has been brought to the fore with things like cauda equina syndrome. In that, with cauda equina syndrome, you would say something along the lines of, if you were to develop these symptoms, then that can be indicative of something more serious. So please do go and seek medical attention. And I have been considering this in rheumatology, and sometimes I'll say that that's, to a patient, if you develop this, then you really should go to your GP or come back to me or go and seek help from a rheumatologist. But it's really difficult to know where that line is. Who do I counsel those patients? Because lots of people have the potential to get rheumatology conditions. So I think I just do it on a gut feel basis. So if someone's got a lot of family history or a lot of past medical history of rheumatology conditions, then I'll counsel them on what a red hot swollen joint looks like, or whether if they suddenly get back pain and it is worse in the mornings, better with activity, worse with rest, those kind of things, then I will give them a bit of that information on occasion. But I have to admit, it's something that I find myself not doing too much, because I don't want people going and Googling it, getting scared, getting concerned. So you do have to trade that off a little bit. And if I'm totally honest, I don't really know where the line is for that at the moment. It's something I need to put some more thought into, really, and discuss. But we know that things like, for example, we talked about Crohn's and colitis at the beginning of this discussion, and we know that with colitis, there's about a 1 in 4 chance, 1 in 5 chance of developing a spondyloarthritis within 6 years of diagnosis. So if you've got someone in clinic who has colitis, recently diagnosed, and then I have no issue against counselling them and saying, if you were to develop this back pain that has this kind of inflammatory flavour to it, then do come back and seek my assistance. But we've got to try and do that in a reassuring way that's not sort of scary. And that's something that I think is quite a challenge to do, but certainly something you might consider appropriate. Emma was just saying hi, so hi, Emma. Thank you for tuning in. Again, the same with things like rheumatoid arthritis. I get a number of my sort of second opinion patients come through to me, and the referral will say something like, this patient's got a strong family history of rheumatoid arthritis. Do you think they have rheumatoid arthritis? And for whatever reason, I think that they don't. I will then say, these are the symptoms. It's part of my normal discussion. These are the symptoms I would expect with something like rheumatoid arthritis. And these are the symptoms you have, which is why I don't think you have rheumatoid arthritis. However, if you were to develop symptoms like that, then of course come and seek help. So I think phrasing it in that manner explaining your clinical reasoning is probably the most helpful way of doing it, rather than sort of battering anybody with it and trying to scare them. We're not trying to scare them, but scaring them by accident. I don't think we should do that at all, because, you know, whilst we do have delays to diagnosis with these conditions, we also don't want to be scaring patients or massively over referring them into rheumatology either. Because that's just a poor use of healthcare resources, and of course we don't want to go wasting any of those either. So that's sort of all of the questions that I'd picked out for answering that I'd missed out, or enforceably missed out, at TherapyLive. So if anybody has got any more questions, they do chuck them in the chat bar. We've got a couple more minutes. Otherwise, you can find the presentation I gave on TherapyLive. If you missed out or decided to choose one of the other talks over mine, which is highly offensive in my opinion, then you can go back and watch it. You can go to therapy-live.co.uk/membership, and you can join there to see all of the recordings of TherapyLive. You can also do the same, therapy-live.co.uk/recordings, and that will enable you to purchase just the recordings from TherapyLive Pelvic Health, which are all excellent. 23 of those, they're all brilliant. Mine's probably somewhere in the middle. Let's not be over egotistical. And you can purchase those and have indefinite access to those, and of course mine's there. Of course, there is tons of information that I try and keep up to date on my website. So if you head to Rheumatology.Physio, and there's a blog on there, which these Chewing It Overs go out on there as well. So there's a blog where I try to do a clinical topic every month. I try to do one of these every month, and they're all as video if you don't want to read it, but I also release them all as podcasts as well, so they will work out about 6 or 7 minutes where I'll read the blog to you, so you can hear my voice talking you through that blog. There is, of course, as well on my website, you can find all of my courses that are available if you want to go more into depth on rheumatology, and there's a recorded course as well. If you find it more difficult to get into one of the live courses, then the recorded course is available for you to go through at your own pace. Again, that's something you can have access to indefinitely. It's about 5.5 hours, that course, with case studies and different tasks for you to do, and videos and all that kind of thing. So it's quite in depth, and it goes over quite a lot. But otherwise, if we haven't got any further questions for today, then thank you very much to those of you who have joined me across the different channels, and I will be back in a month's time to do another one of these takeovers. So if anybody's got any topics you want me to cover, then please do send them to me. Again, you can find me on social media, Rheumatology.Physio on Twitter, Facebook. Now I've got a Facebook page, and Instagram, and I also have a LinkedIn page as well, if that's your sort of thing. So just type Rheumatology.Physio into pretty much anywhere, and you'll find me, and you can get hold of me. So thank you very much for all of you tuning in, and the regular watchers will know that as soon as I press the video button, you're all going to get deafened. So you may want to turn your volume down, and otherwise I will see you in a month's time, and bye for now.